Hello, welcome to Rise Up Fool. Uh, Again, this is the series where we're talking to Latino organizers once a month. Today I got Alejandro Negrete, um, but everyone just calls him Negrete. So again, we're talking to Latino organizers. So let's get right into those two words, Latino and organizer, right? So first with Latino, Negrete. How do you identify as because is it Latino, Latinx, Hispanic? Like, who are you?
I myself identify as Chicano.
Chicano.
Yeah, Chicano. Um, I feel like it was something that growing up in Oxnard, I think that it was a word that I knew but meaning more Mexican American. Pero cuando, when I went to college and went to Long Beach and really started getting a little bit more into what Chicano meant. And to me, Chicano has always meant uh, um, having a political ideology, right? And so I've always identified as Chicano.
And there's people who spell Chicano with Che with the CH, and then I see the Chicano with an X. Like, how do you spell it, and like, what's the difference?
To me, I spell it with an X. I
Okay.
spell it with an X. Again, it was part of something that was a little bit more ingrained when I, again, just started learning and really opening my mind more to it, and more about our history, but more of like Chicano history of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and recognizing there has been a lot of fluidity to terms, labels. And so I realized, you know what, for myself, next, and the fact that in Nahuatl, you also, at least what has been taught to me, the X does have that more of the H, the CH Chicano pronunciation. I've also seen it XICANO, right?
Oh wow.
But like I tell people, the tattoo on my arm says an X. That's what I'm gonna go with.
You can't erase that anymore, man. Not for
No.
free. All right, so that's the Latino side. Now the organizer side. I think if you can give us sort of a background as to like how long you've been organizing and what was the first thing that you ever got involved with, no matter how small, how like your first sort of point where you got political, and kind of like a brief overview of your resume almost, right? Like where you've been and like where you're at now.
All right. Well, actually, you know what? I was talking to my wife about this yesterday. Um, Next year, actually, no, I'm sorry, this year, in July. For whatever reason, dates like this stick to my mind, but July of this year will be 20 years that I've been involved with the labor movement.
Oh wow.
At least with the labor movement, it started for me at Long Beach State. I started working for CFA, the California Faculty Association, the professors union, right? They were organizing a contract fight. My mentor at the time, Armando Vasquez Ramos, recruited me to take on that position. And so I always remember July, I signed on to be a student intern, right, to organize students. To me, that's when I started, I can say, the labor movement. But in regards to organizing or getting more politically involved or starting to develop a political consciousness, which is the way I view it, is it predates that a couple more years. I want to say like around 99, 2000. When I got to Long Beach State, I joined, or I got to know folks and members of an organization, La RAZA Student Union, which had gone through a couple name changes, but it originated from UMAS, United Mexican American Students, to MECHA, to La RAZA. And I went with them to a protest out at Cal Poly Pomona. They were protesting the unjust firing of a Chicano administrator. And we went to their Founders Day. And so I went. I had never been a part of a protest. And so when we go, we're out there gritando, right? We're yelling. And it's for the first time I realized, whoa, I can actually use my voice literally, right, as a form of action and as a way of speaking out. And that action, right, I think was what sparked, like my path towards organizing, community, as a student, and then from there into labor movement. But yeah, I cut my teeth organizing, as a student organizer at first, kind of just learning, building relationships with folks within La RAZA. And, you know, it was fun. It's college, you know, it's a little different. Pero that's where I feel, you know, that I learned a lot of the skills that I applied, at least in my initial years of organizing. So when I started organizing with CFA in 2001, I was with them for about 2 years. And then again, my mentor at the time said, look, there's this militant union out of LA. It's HERE Local 11. And they're looking for summer interns. You know, I want you to meet somebody. And I was introduced to a recruiter. Her name is Pat Lamborn. And I met with her. And she kind of told me about the summer program that was going on. They needed people who were local. And I was living in Long Beach at the time. They were in LA. And I said, sure, I'll go ahead and do it. And that's really what, you know, at the time, I really didn't know what union organizing or labor movement organizing really was about, aside from my experience with CFA. But then I realized, wait, you can get paid for being a desmadroso, right? To being out there and causing a ruckus, and doing what you believe in. And so I went in summer of '03. I did a summer internship with them, and it just blew my mind, right? I was exposed to a movement of predominantly mujeres, right? Women, Latinas, you know, who spoke up, and not only just spoke up, right? They stood up not just for themselves and for others, and they were some really great organizers. And for me, that was powerful, right? That was powerful, and it just blew my mind. And I was like, I want to be a part of this, right? This is something I want to be a part of. So I did a summer internship in '03, came back in 2004. At the time, the summer program was called Union Summer, through the AFL-CIO. I don't know if they do it anymore, but I did it in '03, came back in '04 as a coordinator. My responsibility in '04 was to recruit other, you know, young Chicanos, Chicanas out of Long Beach State, which I did. Mm-hmm. And that's actually the first opportunity I got to go to New York and organize out there. Came back to LA. And then when I was done with my internship, they were like, look, I knew of a program, right? To be able to go get organized in hotels and shops, right? And I said, you know what? The best way for me to really understand what, because I was a college student, you know, and it's not the same. You know, I was fortunate enough that I didn't have to have a full-time job at the time. But then as circumstances started changing, I was like, I do need a job, you know, something that pays my bills and continues to pay my studies. And so what better way to go get a job at a hotel? And para que no me tenga que contar, right? So I don't have to hear from others what the experience is like. I went and found out for myself, right? And so I got a job at a hotel, organized there. We organized underground for about 4 years in Orange County. And we won, right? We organized the union. And it's got to be one of my first, you know, proud moments I ever had. Organizing about close to 300 workers, and being in that fight and being a leader in that fight, which is, you know, a great experience for myself. And maybe not to go too long, but from there, just continue to do what's called non-union organizing, right? With Local 11, I came on staff with them in around '06, right? '06, I went on staff with them. Stayed in LA through 2014, doing, you know, wide range of organizing, different places, LA, Orange County, Santa Monica. I had the opportunity to go to Texas, Colorado, you know, Chicago, other places. And yeah, did that for many years. Then in 2014, you know, I made the hard choice, because I say hard choice because, you know, I decided to move from the LA area and come up to the Bay Area, you know, especially around Napa. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't an easy choice, because I was leaving, you know, friends and family, especially my organizing family that I had known for so many years, and decided to leave. And it wasn't easy, but I left on good terms, and I still stayed with UNITEHERE in Local 2 in San Francisco. I was there for about 5 years. And then again, just had to make the decision, just because the commute and everything was difficult from where I was at and where I was living and going in the city. So I just finally decided to make a change. And as of a year ago, I got hired. I work with the California School Employees Association. So it's another union, and it's a union representing almost 250,000 school support staff right here in the state. Cafeteria workers, bus drivers, clerical, paraeducators. It's the folks that do all the hard work in our schools and support the students. So, that's what I've been doing for the last year.
Orale, so 20 busy years. So it's kind of amazing, right? Because I met you in La Raza, right? I was at Long Beach for a little bit, and that's how I got involved in the union. But I didn't know you had all that background from before then, right? And it's just like I feel like we get so involved into our campaigns, and like the focus was the campaign we were working on that moment. And even though like we hung out, like I was gone to your apartment, you'd come to my place, like we'd always, I didn't have a car, you were always my ride everywhere, right? Like you were always picking me up, and we'd be talking. But like it's funny until now. It's like, oh, like I didn't know you were involved with organizing the professors and like that you had done the union summer already before then.
You know what though? The way I look at it, and over time, right? It's the way I view. I kind of share it, especially with like new organizers or even new workers that I meet for the first time. Because one of the things that I always ask is how people get involved, right? Like, how did you get involved? And the reason that I asked the question, not just to say, hey, well, does your organizing resume somehow compare to mine, right? To me, it's not about that. For me, the way I look at it is, we all come from different places, right? Even though we're all RAZA, Latinos, Latinx, right? Chicano, whatever you want to consider yourself, we all have different experiences. And for me, it's interesting how our paths are crisscrossing at this moment. And so your path and my path crisscrossed at Long Beach, And to me, it's always, well, what did you do before? How did you get here? Because we may have shared experiences. And then some of them aren't shared experiences, but to me, it's, what was that like? Because maybe there's something that you went through that I didn't, and vice versa. And you can always learn from each other from that.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, because where you're at now, are these public employees?
Yeah, the public employees. They work for the school districts.
Okay. So I've always just been on the private side, but I've always heard that it's different, right? That's always like that. There's public and private, right? And it's just like I don't understand the distinction. Like, why is there a distinction, and how is it different? Like, can you talk a little bit about that?
It is different. It is different. It ranges. In the private sector, you leverage private companies, and my experience was, again, within the hotel companies, primarily, if not, maybe food service companies that run arenas or airports and stuff like that, but they're private entities. And because they are private, you also, there's different rules to their game than the public. Because, for example, if you're in a campaign, when you're trying to organize a group of workers, the laws are stacked against workers, period, in this country, right? Private or public, the laws are stacked. But in the private sector, even much more, right? Because private companies don't have to abide by certain rules and regulations, or, they just, because they're private entities and private corporations. And in the public sector, because school districts, for example, right? School districts, they have to answer to the community. They have to answer to a school board. They have to answer to the state, and ultimately to you and I, who are taxpayers. Aside from being an organizer here in this new union, I'm also a parent, right? My son is 6th grade. My daughter's a 3rd grader. So I view it from both perspectives, right? As, in the labor movement, but also as a parent. And that is completely different, because private companies, answer, at least in my experience, answer to either like a board, an executive board within their own company who make their own rules, or to shareholders, right? And that group of shareholders is much smaller than if we're talking about, you know, a community of thousands of folks who are parents and you know, such of that. So, but the public sector also has the benefit that, you know, especially with the organization I'm in now, a lot of the things that they've won over decades, right, for the last, you know, almost 100 years, they have won it through the political process, right? Through state assembly bills, Senate bills, state Senate bills, right? Things getting passed, or the governor also passing certain, and especially here in the state of California, which is heavily blue, and you know, compared to the rest of the country,
right,
it is easier to get candidates either at the local, state level elected, who are going to be more friendlier and be like, okay, yes, let's pass these protections, right? And so the school districts have to abide by like something like education code, right? They have to abide by those things. Where in the private sector, you don't have as many rules and regulations.
right. Okay, that makes sense. I'm glad you brought up being a father, because that's what I want to talk about, right? I want to talk about family, right? Like, I think that's a good way to sort of put a theme onto this conversation. Now that you kind of have an idea of your background, and you know, you're not just some armchair revolutionary, like, hey, give me all your theories and all your ideas. It's like, nah, you've been doing this for 20 years, right?
Right.
And so I want to talk about family, because in that piece I wrote, right, about, I kind of called to question, right, like, why does leadership in a lot of unions not reflect the membership, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not all unions, right? I noted that there were some that are like, at least on paper, it looks great.
Mm-hmm.
But as this country becomes more and more Latino, right, I'm like, I think we need to see more representation. And I got, and I was talking about how like Latinos sort of like, sometimes we're not thought of as like strategic thinkers, has been my experience. Like, it's like, hey, like, if I was raised my hand because I'm like, I don't think we should do this, it's like, well, that it wasn't my place to raise my hand, right? It's kind of like, hey, you're here to do a job, right? Go do it. Like, don't, you're not supposed to think. So that's been part of my experience at times. And the reason I talk about family is because when I say strategy, I don't, we could sit here and talk theory all day. You could say, oh, Foucault, y Marx, y esto y todo, whatever, right? But it's like, we know when you're in a home talking to a worker, that's not what's gonna get someone to like go on strike, right? Like, it's not, well, let me explain to you commodity fetishism, right? Like, they're not
Right.
like, or like Chess Foucault theory says this. It's like, no,
Exactly.
and let me tell you how power works. It's like, that's not the conversations, right? Ultimately, I feel like, at least, and I'm not as experienced as you, but even in my little involvement in organizing, is that like a lot of it is about family, right? And it's about like, it's about what we want from our family, and our family needs to support us, right? They need to support us, right? Like, it's like, dude, if you're gonna risk your job by going on strike, like, your family needs to back you up on that, right? Like, so I want to kind of get a sense of like how your family plays a role. Like, how was your family growing up, number one? And then also, like, so your parents, your brothers, right? And then also, like, how does your family now play a role, right? Like, your wife, your kids, like, how does that, does it play a role? How does it play a role in terms of your organizing?
I think it's definitely played a role, you know, at times positive, you know, actually most times positive, but with family, you know, it can also be negative.
Yeah.
It could be negative. I think that when I first got involved, and again, like I told you, started developing that political consciousness, I started going against my parents' goals, right? My parents are both from Michoacan. You know, my mom came here to this country, you know, around, she was like 8, 9, 10 years old. You know, venían las temporadas, right? They'd come for the seasons of picking strawberries and grapes and all that. My great-grandfather, my grandfather would come here. They came as braceros during World War II. And so my dad, on the other hand, he came, when my dad came to this country, he came in the trunk of a Mustang. You know, those were stories he would share with us because he wanted us to know, like, what he went through. And it wasn't like not rubbing it in type of thing, but just so that we knew, right, like the history and where all the sacrifices, right, really started. And not as pay me back, but take that with you, right? Take that with you and do better than we did. So when I got to college and I came back, and I remember having a conversation around all these crazy ideas of community, and you know what, making money isn't a priority for me. Right. He looked at me like, then why the hell did we send you to college for? Yep. And I think for a lot of Latino, Chicano, right, Chicana organizers, that's been a struggle because our families, at least, some of our first experiences, either in the community and or in college per se, and it involves a lot of sacrifice, right? It does, require a decision to say, I am not going to, be set on the path to say I am going to wear a suit and tie and my interest to make money, right? It's not. It's more of, there's people in my community, there's people that I know that need things. What can I do for it? Is it something as basic as food? Is it access? Is it, housing? And so it's a sacrifice. So when I first got involved, my parents were not happy, right? They were not happy about it because to them, they sent me to college to do better than them. But for a while, they thought it was just a phase. Se le va a quitar, right? Don't worry, he'll get over it, right? He'll get over it, he'll be fine. And I think that's where it was a big obstacle, challenge, struggle, right? To be able to have them recognize, look, this isn't a phase of my life. I may have my long hair and I'm out in the streets screaming Chicana power, right? And stop police brutality and all these things. But I needed them to understand that this is what I believe in and this is who I am. And so I honestly have to say that for, several years, I struggled with getting them to acknowledge and respect. I was looking for respect of the decision that I was making. Yeah. Don't get me wrong. I made some decisions in my life that weren't the best and things that created my own struggle. But through all that, my organizing, I continued to do it. So early on, that was a challenge. But the interesting thing, though, was that when I would walk into someone's living room, right, from a hotel worker or what have you, I would share my parents' struggle and my connection to it. And I'm like, being a young 20-year-old, I would say, I am your child, right? And because some of them had kids my age. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, I'm actually a product of what you're doing. And so I would really connect with that. And it was one of the things in sharing my story, we'd call it, right? I'd share, look, my parents are from Michoacan. They came to this country and they struggled. They worked in the fields. And it was honestly my motivator to get involved. I saw my parents work in the fields, coming home, batidos and lolo, right, kicked in mud. And I saw them struggling. And, even though I was really young. And so for me, that motivated me to say, wait, there's always a story I would share was that my mom cleaned houses también, right? She cleaned houses. And we would go to this house about 2 towns down from Oxnard, right? I'm from Oxnard, born and raised there. And so we would go to Camarillo, where there was a little bit more money there. And there was a neighborhood called Spanish Hills. And Spanish Hills had mansions, right? Like little mansions. Yeah. And she cleaned this one lady's house, this one family's house, youngish couple, now that I'm almost 40, I'm like, they were kids, right? But it was a couple. And they had all this money, and my mom would take me with her, and I remember we would drive up to the gate, and she would punch the little intercom, and they'd let us in, and we would drive up the hill, and as you're driving, you would pass a small orchard of oranges. They had a running track, like a track in the front yard, a pool, and a jacuzzi out there, and I would go, and the thing, my mom would take me, and this is kind of the irony of it. She would take me because she was like, quiero que veas cómo vivan los ricos, right? Like she wanted me to see how rich people live. And she wanted me to be motivated, inspired, and say, I want that too. And I told her years later, I'm like, that wasn't what happened. The opposite happened.
Right.
I was like, why does my mom, who works a million times harder than these people ever will, why do they have that and my parents don't, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of started, the fire in me to be like, certain things just aren't right. And it's not about just work hard for it. My parents worked very hard for what they had. And if we're going to base it on just based on work, my parents should be millionaires multiple times over, right?
Right.
But I think that's kind of how family was important to me early on. Then, met my wife at Long Beach State. We got married, and we have 2 kids, right? And that ultimately transformed in a little bit of a different light to say, like, I also have the same mentality as my parents. Like, I want my kids to have something better than what I had, pero también to be able to bring that consciousness to it. And to say, look, as much as I am sacrificing here, I do hope that one day my kids will be like, we understand why he was doing it, because it also comes at a cost. It comes at a cost of working 12, 14-hour days,
Right.
and having my wife, right, really take on a huge role and responsibility with our kids. But to say this, I'll leave it at this, is that I could not have gotten to this point of so many years in the labor movement without my wife, right? She, that was a conversation my old director told me once. It's like, look, she's also very has the same consciousness as I do. And to me, it's like, we believe in the same things. Like, I need to go do this. And the only way I'm able to do it is like with your support. And she, it's not, I'm going to say it's perfect, but she has backed me up and been there, and been the organizer on other aspects of our lives, which without her, I don't get it done, So that's where I think family has been super important, both at the beginning and even now.
Yeah. So, yeah, right. Like, cause I think that's, I'm struck by like that conversation with workers where you're like, I'm your kid, right? Like, and it's like making those connections, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's when I'm thinking of like, how are we going to, right? I said we, like I'm doing something. How?
No, it's we, brother. It's we.
How are people going to grow this movement, right? That's been like on a decline, right?
Mm-hmm.
For years. And to me, is when I look at the Latino community, I see not just like the future members, right? But I also see like they're also what people call the scabs, right? When you're thinking of like, hey, here are the Latinos that are going to go on strike. It's also Latinos that are hired by temp agencies that are going to come in to replace the workers on strike. So like, right, that's an interesting dynamic, right? And it got me thinking about like the Pullman workers, the porter workers, right? So like A. Philip Randolph is organizing people on this idea of race pride, right? And he said like, organizing African American men on not just to join the union, not just on class, but he's talking about race pride, right? And is ends up forming the first African American union in the country. And I've been thinking about Pullman a lot, just because like Pullman's here in Chicago, in that connection. But I was, then he eventually does a march on Washington. Before the Civil Rights March on Washington, the precursor to the Civil Rights Movement. Then obviously, of course, later MLK goes to Memphis, right, to support sanitation workers. So there's that like feedback loop, right, of like labor organizing on race, right? And then folks organizing on race coming back to support labor. And that's kind of like at least in the African American and like Black history, that's you could sort of see that timeline. And I was thinking about that in terms of like, well, our people, right? Like Latinos, right? Like I see, like if we're gonna talk family, like if like every time people sometimes go in front of a mic, they're like brothers and sisters, right? Like it's so easy to say brothers and sisters, right? But who's our brothers and sisters? Our brothers and sisters are like the kids in cages at the border, right?
Right.
I feel like the labor movement needs to lead in like on those fronts as well, right? They gotta lead on I think not. Yeah, there needs to be class solidarity, but there's a part of me that thinks like, where's that like race pride too, right? Where's that organizing on that? And I think I see pockets of it, but I think if you see like who's leading those fights right now, I don't think it's labor. I think labor gets involved and they support, right? And they're allies. Labor's good allies, but like I mean, who's leading it now? You could like name him, right? Like Black Lives Matters lead, like right? You could sort of name the Dreamers, right? You could name different folks leading these fights, and I think unions support, but they're not leading those fights. At least that's my opinion from the outside. It's what it looks like, right?
To a certain extent, though, because we could even debate that. Like, do we want labor leading those fights?
Oh, that's a good point.
Because look, I'll tell you this. I think the thing that labor brings to those that I think what really could bring to those movements is structure, right? And I say that from like experience on like how to mobilize, how to turn people out. How do you get how do you run a program, right? Is the word that I can come up with, right? How do you run a program of, is it because I feel like there's a lot of things and how to maintain them for an extended period of time, because say what you want about labor, but at least and there's the decline, right? And there's a lot of problems. And so I think maintaining like that or not the struggle, but the continuing that fight of the struggle, right, is something that labor can bring to the table. But it's funny you bring up the Dreamers. And I remember when that was going on, and labor really wasn't getting involved. And I think even from a perspective, I remember talking to organizers, other Chicano organizers. It was like, well, good luck. Let's see what they do. And I don't think there was much thought that they would be able to succeed, right? And get what the Dreamers were able to achieve in regards to DACA, right?
Right.
I think there was sometimes a question, and it wasn't until the Dreamers really started pushing the envelope of like, wait, they are being effective, and which I think is great. But the reason I say I don't know how much labor should get involved, I think stems from what your article and your question was about. Is, do I really want the heads of these unions chiming in and directing what the Dreamers are doing?
Oh, right. I wasn't even thinking about that.
Well, right, because look, if there is a disconnect,
right,
there is a disconnect. So to me, it's early on when I started, I'll tell you, 20 years ago when I got involved, I was very Chicano nationalist, right? Like it's only our RAZA, right, and that's it.
Yeah.
And it wasn't till I got involved and started organizing, and I started meeting, whites, blacks, Filipinos, right, Asian, right, folks that were like, oh wait, you're also down for the struggle, and you are also willing to sacrifice. And then even more so, I met white folks who struggled more than I did growing up.
Yeah.
And I'm like, damn, I thought I had it bad. You had it bad. And so when I saw that, it was like, oh, okay. So for me, I'm not pissed off at the scabs who go do those jobs. I'm more upset as those who go recruit them, right? And those who are like, hey, let me pay you $25 an hour or $40 an hour for the next 2 weeks, because like look, if you're offering and this happened during the Marriott fight, and you were talking about it, during the Marriott campaign of, what year was it? We're in 2021 now. It was like 2018, right? 2018, the strikes across the country, with the Marriott fight. We were out in San Francisco and standing outside of the Marriott. And I remember seeing a busload, 2 buses of scabs get off, all RAZA. And what we found out was that these folks had gone down to like Salinas and Watsonville, right? And hit up all our farm workers and we're like, hey, we'll offer you 30, 40 bucks an hour. You just got to go clean. Now, going back to, what do people prioritize? Is it politics? Or is it, I got to feed my kid, I got to pay rent. And, so for them, it's like, I got to do it. And so again, when they get off, unfortunately, I wasn't able to have those conversations directly with them. One guy did kind of peel off and gave us this information, but it was the person, it was this one woman who was like, no, don't listen to them. Come over here, come over here. That's the person that to me, I'm like, they're the ones that are wrong.
Yeah.
Right. And so, but anyways, so when I think about that, that's part of it, right? The identity politics of it. Pero to me, movements like the Dreamers and Black Lives Matters, right? I don't say the word appreciate. I love the fact that these type of movements have been grassroots based, because I don't know if labor is capable anymore of doing that, right? I think we labor as a whole is already institutionalized to a certain extent. And I think the movements that we do have are already within, established programs. Yeah. Which is not a bad thing. It's just to expect labor to veer off their path already and to spark something in the community. It'll to that same level to say, hey, given the same autonomy, right? I don't know if they would, right? They would have, it would come with, I don't want to say strings attached, but it would come like, look, this is the way we know how to organize, and this is the way we're going to do it. Now, what I think, like organizations that I've come from and styles of organizing, right? Like relational organizing, that is something that I do believe that the labor movement, or at least those more militant organizations, more militant unions that do organizing, right? I'm not talking about servicing. I'm talking about real organizing and empowerment. That's something we could share, right? Mm-hmm. And I would hope and I would wish. Now, I don't believe, right? I don't believe that the major unions are going to invest the time to do so. But I do have a lot more faith and trust that those, right, organizers, like, that I've worked with and organized, who have come up through the same systems and organizing styles, they're going to branch off and be like, look, if I'm not finding what I need, or at least that same direction here, I'm going to use this skill set and I am going to go establish it elsewhere, right? And work with other organizations. So it's like I said, it's an interesting conversation and we could debate it all day, but I do think that labor should be there to support. Labor has the resources to support, but I don't know if, I don't believe labor should be co-opting, right? They shouldn't be co-opting these movements. So that's where it's a fine dance. Yeah. Because these movements don't trust labor, right? They're, and Latino, Chicano organizations in the community who are like, you may look like me, but you come from labor. And you guys have a different, agenda.
Is that distrustfulness deserved?
Yeah.
Yeah? Oh.
Yeah, because it comes back to your point of your article.
Yeah.
Because they're not looking at necessarily the individual that's in front of them. They're looking at what is your organization done as a whole.
Right.
And I think that this, I think it is well deserved.
Wow. Yeah, I think, look, this is why I wanted to do this monthly series and bring people, because it's so easy, especially writing for like Latino rebels, right, is when you're writing about race and immigration, there's this temptation to like write a solution, right? Because you don't just want to complain, because who wants to read just complain? And there's this
Right.
temptation, right? So like, I'll complain for half of the piece, because fine, right? But then the problem is that there's this temptation to write a solution. But here's talking about what we're talking about right now. I have way more questions than solutions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that part of what this series will do is bringing like someone every month and sort of like hearing this, right? And sort of like, you've already like blown my mind a couple times. Like, I'm just like, that's a good point. That's a good, like, just, I wasn't even thinking about it in those terms. Well, look, Negrete, thanks for coming on. I want to end this out with one last question, because we're talking about family. Like,
Right.
right, if like years from now, if your kids were like, hey man, like what's my dad about? Like, what was he doing? Right? And they're like, what? And they came back and watched this. Like, what would you want to tell your kids?
I think that's well, now you come back with a good question. It's always hard for me. It's always been, whenever I've gotten the question of like, what do you want to do in 5 to 10 years, right? I'm like, I don't know, right? It's always one of the things that I'm like, I don't know. But I think with your question, I think it ties into a lot of my motivation early on is to be like, look, I recognize that their father is not, far from perfect, and I think none of us are. Pero I think if going back and if they watch this or anything else and look to see what was my father about, I hope that they be like, yeah, like, look, he like, he had conviction, right? And conviction and passion for what he did. And for me, it being able to demonstrate that to them, but also like, because again, the way I organize and the way that I was taught to organize has a lot to do with it. But it's also combined with, going back to family, of, my antepasados. My grandmother, in paz descanse, she passed away when I was really young. And I named my daughter after her, Elisa. And so when we ask about her, like, how was she? Again, my parents would tell me, like, look, she was the type of woman that if she saw somebody out there and we'd come up asking for un vaso de agua, for a cup of water, what do you need? Here's some food. She would help people out. And to me, it's at least those core, beliefs and willing, thinking more of the collective. That's what I hope that my kids walk away from, that to say, your great grandmother did it many moons ago, and other people in your family did it too. Your father is just another evolution of that. And the goal, right? I will hope that they understand that the goal is that, again, that they are better than what I am, right? What I would love them to lead the revolution one day, of course, but to me, it's not about that. It's like, just be a better human being than I was. And I think that's what my parents' goals were for me. They just communicated a little bit differently.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, thanks for coming on, everybody.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, if folks like this, we're gonna be doing this once a month. Share it, talk to us in the comments, and we'll see you all next month.